Hey guys, welcome back to my channel, Ship and Read. Today I'll be doing my July wrap up. Before I get started, if you're new to the channel, please don't hesitate to subscribe down below as well as hit the notification bell. But July was actually a really good reading month for me, especially for the second half of July. I feel like I have officially gotten out of my reading slump. I read some really good books, some really fast, very engaging books, and ever since then I've just been in like a reading mood, and I'm so happy about that. But for July, I read a total of 18 books, and out of those 18 books I read 5,688 pages, which is such a huge increase compared to last month. And then in terms of the rating, I gave one book 2 stars, one book 3 stars, 2 books 3.5 stars, 7 books 4 stars, which is crazy, and then I gave 7 books 5 stars. That's just wild. I feel like a lot of books this time around were like 4 stars and up, which is freaking amazing. Like most of the books, like 14 of the books were like that. And so I'm just excited to kind of go through all the books in this video and just kind of share my thoughts on these books. The first book I want to discuss is Sisters of the Snake by Serena and Sasha Nanua. This book is actually a really good book. I gave this book 4 stars. I think because I haven't really heard too much about this book and people talking about it, I didn't go into this book with any sort of expectation. And I think because of that, I thoroughly enjoyed this book. It was fun. It was entertaining. I love the sisters, their relationships, just like the plot itself, and just learning about what's happening with the political stuff, everything, which is a really fun time. This book basically follows 2 sisters. One is a princess and the other is a thief on the streets, and due to circumstances they end up meeting one day. They bump into each other, realize that they literally look identical, that they're twins, and they decide to switch places. And so that's essentially what this book is about. There's a war looming. There is a lot of politics involved, like I mentioned already, and now they switch places. And the thing is, both of their lives have a lot of dangers lurking in the background, a lot of like magic happening, just a lot of like craziness that's ensuing right now. And overall it's a really fun time. The only issue I have with this book is the fact that there were so many like conveniences and weird like disruptions. I don't even know what to call it, but like basically, for example, there was a time when, so at this point like they switched places, right? So there are times when they know something that they should not know because of their past, like who they really are. And so for example, the princess, who is actually the thief right now, went off somewhere and she noticed a cat, and she recognized the cat because of her time as a thief on the streets. And so obviously as a princess, she should have no idea who this cat is, no relation whatsoever, but she actually said the cat's name out loud. And like the person that she's with literally gave no indication, like, oh, why do you know the cat's name? Like, how is that possible? You know, like I didn't realize that you're familiar with this cat, like, etc. And like there's like so many incidences like that where like it just didn't make sense, when there are little like mistakes there that like should have been so obvious to like anyone around. Like, wait, how would you know that? You know, like things like that. That is just like, the fact that these things occurred like really irked me sometimes, because I'm like, that doesn't make any sense. Like it just seemed like bad editing or something like that, or like weird plot line like holes, you know, like it just did not make sense basically. But other than that though, like I still really enjoyed the plot. Like I just had a really fun time just reading everything and finding out more information about like all the different characters. Like I just had a fun time. That's all I can really say about this book. And so I feel like this, purely like for my enjoyment, this is a 4-star read. But objectively speaking though, I would say this is probably like a 3-star read, maybe even lower, just because of those like plot holes and like mistakes that were just like there, and like no one ever like assumed anything. Like it's one thing if it happened like one time, but it happened like multiple times. And every time it happened, I'm like, how does no one, like, she just slipped up and like no one notices it? Like, I call bullshit. So anyways, that's what I'm gonna say for this book. I still gave it 4 stars though, out of pure enjoyment. Then the next book I picked up is Crying in H Mart, which I gave 3.5 stars. So this is a book that everyone has been talking about for so freaking long. It's basically a memoir. Everyone loves it. I honestly thought it was just an okay read. It was good. I liked it. There were some emotional moments in it, but I feel like because I had such high expectations about how everyone just loved it, it wasn't amazing to me. And so I ended up just giving the book 3.5 stars. It was not a bad book, but I think my expectations were a little bit too high to the actual reality of the book. Then the next book I picked up is King of Battle and Blood by Scarlett St. Clair. This book I gave 4 stars. This is basically a fantasy romance featuring vampires. It follows Isolde, who is a princess. I think she's like the soul princess or something like that, and she considers her wedding day to be her death day because she is supposed to marry the vampire king. And this is someone who has basically ravaged her country, taken control of so many different like regions in the area, like different like territories, and her father feels like allying himself with this vampire king is their only like their best bet of like saving their people. And so the day that they meet each other, for some reason the vampire king is like, you know what, I want to marry Isolde. That's how we're going to get our truce. That's how we're going to get our peace. And the king, because of everything that happened and because of Isolde herself, actually, she's the one who's like, yes, okay, I'll do it for her people. So now she goes back to his kingdom and she's trying her best to kind of like save her people, but also see if she can find a way to kill the vampire king and do her best to defy him because of everything that he has done to her people. And obviously things kind of happen between the two of them as the story progresses. She learns a lot more, understands a lot more about the history of the truth of what really happened many years ago, and like how did vampires come to be, etc. This is actually a really fun read. I feel like I didn't expect too much going into this book because I feel like the last time people said it was like a smutty romance fantasy, I was like high expectations. This time I feel like I had mediocre expectations, and so I actually really enjoyed this book when I was reading it because it was fun, it was entertaining. There was definitely some inks going on between the vampire king and Isolde herself. Like, it was just a fun time. So overall I enjoyed it. There were definitely a few characters that like pissed me off to no end, and I was talking to Katie about this because I was like, they just keep reappearing like cockroaches, you never get rid of them. So that was like the downside to it. But I feel like every book there's always going to be characters that you're not going to like, characters that are very irritable, and there's definitely one character in particular that was exactly that and it pissed me off. But obviously it gave the book a lot more, you know, like depth to it and a lot more like facets to it. So I appreciate like what the character was doing and like his role in this book, but I was not a fan of him. Overall though, I really enjoyed this book and I cannot wait to continue on with the series. I think it comes out later this year in December. I would definitely be picking that up. Then this next book I picked up is When Demple Met Rishi by Sanya Menon. This book I gave 4 stars. This was such a fun read as well. It's a YA contemporary featuring a girl called Dimple, which first of all I'm like, that's a really interesting name because I've never heard of anyone called Dimple before. But she is just trying to go through life. She has everything planned out in terms of her education, in terms of her path, like what she wants to do with herself, you know, her career. But for some reason her mom has this like obsession with finding her the ideal Indian husband. And so for whatever reason though, like she feels like her parents, you know, at the end of the day they should still at least respect her principles of putting her career first instead of marriage and finding a family, all that stuff. But now that she's going off to this summer program for like aspiring web developers, she like believes that her parents won't have anything to do with, you know, finding a husband potentially. But that is not the case because enter Rishi. Rishi is a hopeless romantic. He wants to just find the ideal wife for himself. He believes that his parents truly know him best, so they know who, you know, he will be best with in terms of finding a match. And so he goes to this summer program as well, entirely aware of the situation that Dimple's parents and his parents have met up and decided that two of them are now in an arranged marriage kind of situation. Dimple obviously had no idea, and obviously their first encounter just goes haywire. Things kind of happen from there. It's so freaking entertaining and funny, just like seeing their interactions together, especially how he's like this hopeless romantic and how he just wants to be with her. I mean, that was his sole goal in joining that summer program early, is just to be with her and meet her and, you know, get to know her, whereas her goal is like, who the fuck are you? And she's just trying to be a web developer and, you know, get a leg up with her career. Overall, I just had a really fun time reading this book. Then the next book I picked up is Galland by V.E. Schwab. This book was honestly such a disappointment. This book basically follows a girl called Olivia who is nearing the end of her time at the school for girls. It's basically like an orphanage, and there she's never really like had any good relationships with the teachers, with her peers. No one seems to really care much about her. No one seems to really like her. They just leave her alone. She's just there by herself. And the thing is, she's also able to see ghouls for whatever reason. Like ever since at a young age, she's able to see them. She doesn't really bother them. They don't really bother her. She just come to accept the fact that they're there, they exist, and that's really all there is to it. One day she ends up getting a letter from a mysterious uncle telling her that she belongs to Galland. They're part of her family and they want to meet her and, you know, be with her. So she arrives there and she finds out that this letter is a little off because her uncle has actually been dead. And this estate is actually empty except for her cousin. The thing is, her cousin doesn't want her there either. So now she's like faces the dilemma of like leaving or if she should stay because she's never known any other family before. They're her only, like her cousin's her only family. Finally, she is actually permitted to stay and she decides to stay, but she has a bunch of rules to follow. For example, she can't go out after dusk and she has to stay on the right side of the wall. And, you know, things kind of happen from there when she ends up breaking these rules. This book was weird. I feel like it's very whimsical in the way, but like in a very dark way. Like it's just hard to describe. Like I felt like everything was not particularly fleshed out. It was like an idea that was formed and the author V.E. Schwab just like went along with it, but like nothing was really like detailed out or fleshed out or really developed. So the characters felt very flat. The plot seems very dull. I felt like there wasn't a lot of meat to this book. And overall, like it was just a very dry, boring book and I was not really a fan. It was a quick read though, so at least there's that. I mean, it was a very short book, but the story itself, the book itself was not really the best. I feel like I'm saying 2 stars because I feel like objectively speaking, like in terms of the writing and everything, it's very good. In terms of like my enjoyment though, it's more like a 1 star to be honest. Then this next book I picked up is Dear Martin, which I gave 3 stars. Honestly, it's been a while since I've read this book and I don't really recall too much about this book. It was a book I picked up on a whim. I was going through my shelves and I had the audiobook version of it I got from the library and I figured why not pick it up and just see for myself. I did not care too much for this book. I think it was just an okay read. I don't even remember what this book is about. I don't remember anything super intense about this book. It was just a very like mediocre, middle of the road read for me, hence 3 stars. But because I can't remember anything about this book, I want to say it's even like 2 stars because I honestly can't remember a single detail about this book, nor can I remember like what this book is about or like the characters or like what the issue is. I do know that there was a lot of like big issues that were discussed in this book, but for the life of me I cannot remember them right now at all, which is saying a lot in terms of a book that's supposed to be like powerful. Like that's how I remember this book being presented to me like a couple years ago when this book came out, was that it's supposed to be a very powerful read. The fact that I don't remember after like a week or 2 of reading it says a lot, I think, about my own like perception of the book as well as what I took from the book and how impactful the book actually is. So that's all I'm gonna say for this book. Unfortunately, I looked at my notes and I was like, I don't remember anything about this book, like literally nothing about this book. So there's that. The next book I picked up is Parachutes by Kelly Yang. This book I gave 4 stars. I'm actually really surprised by how much I enjoy this book because this is not a book that I've heard too much about, nor is it a book that had a lot of expectations going into it. I actually thought that the characters were gonna be very like snobbish, but that is not actually the case at all. So this book basically follows 2 characters, 2 girls. One is Claire, where she comes from a very wealthy family in China and she heard about the term parachutes, where basically rich Asian parents have their kids flown to the US or Europe or whatever, like a Western country, while their parents stay behind, and it's a way for them to have a better education, better environment, etc. But Claire herself never thought that should be one of them until one day her parents do exactly just that, sends her off to California where she'll now be attending a private school. And she has a very, you know, rich, wealthy, kind of like spoiled background. On the other hand, we have a girl, her name is Danny, where she is actually the person who is taking in Claire. So Claire is now living with a host family and Danny is the daughter of said host family. So basically she's now her host sister. Danny actually did not like this idea at all, but the money in actually hosting someone helps her family a lot, helps out her mom a lot. So she's like, okay, fine, I'll go along with it, even though I really do not want to have a host sister, especially because based on her experience as someone who goes to school with other like parachutes, they're usually very snobby. They come off very, you know, like up and up, and they're just not from the same world, and so she doesn't really like them. They just seem arrogant, etc. So she doesn't want anything to do with them. But as the story kind of progresses, the 2 of them end up having a lot in common, and there's a lot about what happens with them individually that bring them together. This is a story about immigration, it's a story about social classes, it's a story about racism, as well as a story about sexual assault and rape. So it's just wild. There is triggers obviously for sexual assault and rape. I was like so invested with this book. I really didn't expect too much from it. I expected Claire to be this very snobby, bratty girl. She actually was not. I mean, I feel like there were some tendencies where she did things that kind of made her seem like ignorant, but as soon as she was aware of what she did, she immediately tries her best to like rectify the situation and correct herself, which I feel like not other people would do if they were truly like spoiled and bratty and just like arrogant, because they don't care about anyone else. They just care about themselves. They're just very selfish like that. But she's not like that at all. And so I actually really like Claire as well as Danny. Like I like both of them equally, and there are just so many moments throughout this book that were just so powerful, like the messages that were presented, the stories, the characters themselves, like what they had to go through. Like I feel like this book was just really powerful. So this book actually resonated a lot more with me than, for example, like Dear Martin. So I feel like they're both equally powerful, but this book was not, I don't think this book was ever really like presented as like a very powerful read with important messages, etc. to me, like when I picked up this book, like, you know, when I bought it a while ago. But this book resonated so much. It was way more impactful on me and my own experiences and like what I've heard from society and media and all that stuff, that this book was just way more, like way better for me personally. So yeah, I definitely recommend this book if you know, I don't want to say if you like reading all that, because that's like not something people like normally like reading, but I feel like this book just had a lot of good messages and like education, I guess, to the readers. So if you're like interested in that, I highly recommend this one. The next two books I picked up are Shadow Me and Unravel Me. Shadow Me I gave 4 stars, and for this one I gave 5 stars. This is actually a reread that I am doing for one of my reading vlogs, so this video will not be up yet, but I'm hoping it'll be up in the next couple weeks because I'm still going through all the books right now. But this series, this reread, has been freaking phenomenal. I love everything about the books. Basically follows a girl called Juliet who has the power to basically kill people with just the touch of her skin. And so she has been isolated in this like mental institution for the past 200 something days, almost a year now, and she is so scared of everyone. She's scared of what she can do to people. She doesn't want to be in that situation. She's basically now living life where she's just so like petrified of everything around her. Also, society right now has completely changed. It's a dystopian setting. There's now a new government called the Reestablishment, and after so many days of being by herself, one day she ends up getting a bunkmate. His name is Adam, and at first he treats her like he treats her poorly, but after some time getting to know her a little bit more, he realizes that there's more to her than what was presented to him beforehand. And so they end up, you know, connecting with each other, and she ends up leaving this mental institution because of a commander from the Reestablishment wants to use her as a soldier and train her as a soldier. So the story kind of progresses from there, and this book was just so like good. I love all the characters. I feel like because this is a reread for me, I know what's going to happen, or like I kind of remember what's going to happen like vaguely because I read this like a couple years ago, but I'm still enjoying everything. Not only that, but I feel like I have a better understanding of some of the characters a lot more. I understand Juliet a lot more. I feel like from last time, I remember her just being very whiny, very scared, very like annoying kind of, and I feel like she still has those characteristics, but I understand like where she comes from more. Like I feel like I'm more empathetic to her history and her past than I did before. And not only that, but like Adam, for example, I feel like I liked him a lot before, and obviously at some point like things kind of happened from him, and obviously like people didn't like him anymore, I didn't like him anymore, but I feel like this time I really recognize like how toxic he was as the story progresses. There's so many things that he said, especially in the 3rd book that I'm reading right now. I'm not done with it right now, but like it's just so demeaning and toxic, and it's just like, no, like that's not how you're supposed to treat someone that you supposedly love. So a lot about this book that I absolutely adore. I love the characters. I'm just like gushing over the books right now because I'm just like having a really good time just reading everything and just rereading everything, and it's just pure enjoyment right now. Like I cannot wait to continue on the series and pick up the rest of the books as soon as possible. Then this next book I picked up is Under the Whispering Door, which I gave 4 stars. This is basically a book about a guy who, I believe he was a lawyer, and he lived life, you know, kind of treating people terribly, etc. And one day he ends up dying, and now he's basically at purgatory, where he is trying to like relearn some of the past mistakes and come to acceptance of the fact that he's dead and all that stuff. And he ends up meeting a ferryman, basically someone who's going to like take him on to his next journey and like, you know, bring him and, you know, go through that with him. And obviously as the story progresses, his character changes. He learns a lot more about himself. He learns a lot more about what he did when he was alive. He learns a lot more about the people around him and being a lot more empathetic and a lot more understanding of just people in general. I do feel like the other book I read by this author, House on the Cerulean Sea, was significantly better. I felt a lot more closer with the characters. I love the children in that book, just their relationships with each other. I feel like that book for some reason just resonated a lot more with me. This book, it was still really good, like objectively speaking. The writing was great, the characters was great, the plot was great, but because I didn't have that extra like connection, it didn't feel like a 5-star read, which is why I just gave this book 4 stars. I still think the book is amazing. It just didn't hit me the same way as the other book. Then the next book I picked up is A Nearly Normal Family by M.T. Edwardson. This book I gave 3.5 stars. This book is a psychological legal thriller where it follows an 18 girl. Her name is Stella, where she is accused of a brutal murder of a man. And this book just kind of follows the dad's perspective, the mom's perspective, as well as her own perspective about their relationship with each other as a family, their relationship with individual people, as well as obviously uncovering like what truly happened that night and who is actually behind the murder of this man. This book was actually really good. I would say that because the way how this book is written out is that the first like half of this book was the dad's perspective. His perspective for some reason was like incredibly long. He gave so much backstory in terms of like his relationship with his daughter, his relationship with his wife, their relationship as a family, just the history of what happened, and like his perspective on how he saw himself. And then the second part was the daughter's perspective, and you see the exact same like situation but like from her perspective. So every time it changed perspective, it kind of started from the beginning in a way, so you kind of like had a reread but just in a different perspective, and you see like how she viewed the exact same situation, but it was so different compared to her father's view, for example. And then the very end, last like 10% I would say, was like the mom's perspective. And it was so interesting because like the mom's perspective for some reason was like so short, but she provided so many key elements to the book that like her part was like irreplaceable. Like you needed her part in this book, even though I feel like at sometimes I'm like, I don't understand why her part was so short. I felt like her part could have been definitely fleshed out a lot more. She had a lot to say. I felt like she had a lot to share in terms of like her perspective too, because she definitely, I don't know, like, it was just like so much shorter compared to like everyone else's. Like I don't know why that was the case, but and also not only that, but I feel like the change in perspective was very confusing because every single time it started from like the beginning again. So it was just kind of like, oh, like why are we suddenly like jolted from this whole situation? We're following the story along and suddenly we're like jolted back to the beginning, and it happened like every single time it changed perspectives. So that was like jarring. I didn't like that at all. Other than that though, I still enjoyed the book. I think most of the people from book club enjoyed it. We kind of thought the same way in terms of like the perspectives and how the mom's perspective should have been a little bit more fleshed out, but overall it was still an enjoyable read. The next book I picked up is a book of cold cases, which I gave 4 stars. So this book basically follows 2 characters. One is Beth, where she is accused of murdering these 2 men in cold blood. But the thing is, when she went to court, there was no hard evidence against her. The evidence was able to stick on her, and so she was actually acquitted from these 2 murders. Since then, she's basically lived in isolation in her, you know, mansion. And then in present day, we follow a girl called Shia, or is her name Shia? I'm not really sure how to pronounce that. But she's a receptionist where on her free time, she runs a true crime website called Book of of cold cases, where there's just a bunch of cold cases that are discussed online with a bunch of different people, and she is really obsessed with true crime and just cases in general. One day she ends up meeting Beth by chance, and the two of them start talking, and for some reason Beth agrees to be interviewed by her. And the thing is, as she starts to spend more time with her, interviewing her and just getting to know her, she feels like there's something off. And so now she's not sure if she's talking to someone who is actually a murderer or if there's something else going on. This book was interesting. I really typically enjoy Simone St. James books in the past. There's always some sort of like creepy factor, like ghostly apparitions, like paranormal factor to it, and that's definitely present in this book, as it appears pretty early on, so it's not a spoiler. But I don't know, I feel like this book was good, but it just was not as intense, or nor was it as like gripping as her previous books were. So I gave this book 4 stars, but now that I think about it, it's kind of more like a 3.5 stars, to be honest. Like, it was still really good, but like in retrospect, now that I'm thinking about like the plot and the characters and like how impactful it was, it's more like a 3.5 stars, to be honest. It's still a good book. I really enjoyed it. I love just uncovering everything and kind of seeing like from Beth's perspective while she was growing up, and kind of seeing like what she was going through and kind of like what led her to this day, and just her reasoning and her story. It was actually kind of fascinating to see like what was actually going on and who actually committed the murder. Was it actually Beth? Was it someone else? Like, what's going on here? So it was still a really engaging book, and I was still really fascinated with everything that's going on. So overall, I still really enjoyed it. All right, then the last 6 books that I read were from Bleach. So I read volumes 11 through 16, and I gave all of them 5 stars. They were so freaking good. I definitely cannot wait to continue on the series and just continue reading on with the manga series sometime soon. I don't know if I'll be able to read much of it in August, unfortunately, because I do have so many like readathons that I'm planning, but I'm definitely going to try to pick up more in September, I think, because the new anime for the final arc comes out in October. I don't know if it's like early October or end of October, but either way, I am gonna be obsessed, and I cannot wait to watch it like as soon as possible, because it's so freaking good. Just like all the characters, now that they've grown up a little bit, I don't know like what's the timeline between like the end of the previous, like the anime, and then like where it is now, if there's like a lot of years between all of that. I think it's like 2 years, but not really sure. But anyways, I'm so excited and definitely cannot wait to continue on with the manga series. Anyways, these are all the books that I read this past month. Let me know down below how you've read this past month. Was there any outstanding books that you read? Have you read any of the books that I mentioned this time around? What did you guys think about them? Did you guys agree with me on any of my sentiments on these books? But as always, if you like this video, please do give me a thumbs up. It really does help out my channel. And if you see more content of me, please don't forget to subscribe down below, as well as hit the notification bell. And as always, don't forget to follow me on Twitter and Instagram, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!